The clock on Sarah Johnson's dashboard showed 11:43 p.m. as she drove her sleek black BMW through the quiet streets of downtown Atlanta. Her tired eyes remained focused on the road ahead, while her mind wandered back to the construction site she had just left. As the lead structural engineer for the city's newest skyscraper project, late-night inspections had become a regular part of her routine. The soft hum of her car's engine and the gentle purr of its custom suspension system usually brought her peace after long hours at work. Sarah had carefully designed every modification to her car, ensuring each change met the strict legal requirements while maximizing performance. As a structural engineer, she understood the importance of precision and compliance. Red and blue lights suddenly flashed in her rearview mirror, cutting through the peaceful night. Sarah's heart skipped a beat, but she remained calm. She had been through traffic stops before and knew the drill. Carefully, she guided her BMW to the side of the road, positioning it perfectly under a street light for better visibility. Following standard procedure, Sarah turned off her engine, placed her hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, and waited. Through her side mirror, she watched as a police officer approached, his flashlight beam bouncing with each step. "License and registration," the officer demanded, shining his light directly into the car. Sarah noticed he seemed particularly interested in her tinted windows. "Good evening, officer," Sarah replied politely, slowly reaching for her documents in the glove compartment. "May I ask why I'm being pulled over?" The officer, whose name tag read Officer Martinez, studied her license with a frown. "Your vehicle appears to be in violation of several city codes, ma'am. These windows are tinted well beyond legal limits, and that suspension system looks unauthorized." Sarah felt a familiar knot forming in her stomach. She had dealt with similar assumptions before, but she knew her rights and, more importantly, she knew her calculations were correct. "Officer, I can assure you that all modifications to my vehicle are within legal limits. I have the documentation right here in my—" "Ma'am," Officer Martinez cut her off. "I've been doing this job for 15 years. I know a violation when I see one." His tone left no room for discussion. Sarah took a deep breath, reminding herself to stay professional. "Sir, I understand your concern, but I'm a licensed engineer. Every modification on this car was carefully calculated to meet city regulations. I can show you the specifications." "You can explain that to the judge." Officer Martinez interrupted again, already writing out a citation. "Your court date is in 2 weeks. I'm citing you for excessive window tinting and unauthorized vehicle modifications." Sarah accepted the ticket with a steady hand, though frustration bubbled beneath her calm exterior. She watched as Officer Martinez returned to his patrol car, his dismissive attitude all too familiar. Looking down at the citation in her hands, she noticed he had marked the maximum fines for each violation. As the patrol car pulled away, Sarah remained parked under the street light, taking a moment to process what had just happened. She pulled out her phone and carefully documented the time, location, and details of the stop. Years of experience had taught her the importance of keeping thorough records. Opening her glove compartment again, she retrieved a thick folder containing all her car's modification documentation. Each paper inside represented hours of calculations and careful planning. The window tinting was exactly 70% transparent, well within the legal limit of 65%. The suspension system, while custom, had been designed to enhance safety without compromising the vehicle's structural integrity. Sarah started her car again, the engine's quiet purr a reminder of her expertise and attention to detail. As she drove home, her mind was already formulating a plan for her court appearance. She would need to prepare her documentation, gather relevant city codes, and present her case clearly and professionally. Arriving at her modern apartment complex, Sarah parked in her designated spot and gathered her things. The clock now showed 12:17 a.m. Tomorrow would be another long day at the construction site, but first, she had some legal preparation to do. In her home office, surrounded by engineering certificates and project awards, Sarah began organizing her defense. She pulled up the city's vehicle code on her computer and started cross-referencing her modification specifications. The judge would need to understand not just the legal aspects, but the engineering principles behind her choices. As she worked into the early morning hours, Sarah couldn't help but wonder how many others had accepted similar citations without having the technical knowledge to challenge them. Her expertise put her in a unique position to stand up for herself, and she intended to use it. 2 weeks passed quickly, and Sarah found herself walking up the granite steps of the Atlanta Municipal Court. She had chosen her outfit carefully that morning, a crisp navy blazer, matching slacks, and sensible heels. Her natural hair was styled professionally, and she carried a leather briefcase containing all her documentation. The security line moved slowly as people emptied their pockets and walked through metal detectors. Sarah noticed she was the only one carrying a proper briefcase. Most others clutched manila envelopes or loose papers. The security guard raised an eyebrow at her organized file folders, but waved her through without comment. Following the signs, Sarah located courtroom 304. She arrived 30 minutes early, just as she had planned. Taking a seat in the back row, she observed the room with careful attention. The wood-paneled walls and high ceiling gave the space an imposing atmosphere. A large seal of the state of Georgia hung behind the judge's bench, and American flags stood at attention on either side. More people began filtering in, filling the wooden benches. Sarah noticed a pattern forming. Most defendants were quickly accepting their fines and leaving, heads down. The few who tried to argue their cases were quickly dismissed by Judge William Patterson, a tall white man in his 60s with steel-gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses. Next case, Thompson versus City of Atlanta. The court clerk called out. Sarah watched as a young man in jeans and a t-shirt approached the podium. His traffic violation was similar to hers, modified exhaust system on his truck. "Your Honor," the young man began, "I bought the truck like this. I didn't know." "Ignorance of the law is no excuse," Judge Patterson interrupted, his voice sharp. "The fine stands at $500. Next case." Sarah took notes on her tablet, documenting the judge's reactions and responses. She noticed how he barely looked at the defendants, focusing instead on the papers in front of him. The few times he did look up, his expression remained stern and uninterested. A woman sitting next to Sarah leaned over and whispered, "Don't bother fighting it. Patterson always sides with the police. Just pay the fine and get out of here." Sarah smiled politely but didn't respond. Instead, she continued reviewing her documents one last time. Her calculations were perfect, her permits were in order, and she had even brought the relevant sections of the city code highlighted and tabbed for easy reference. The morning wore on, and Sarah noticed something else. She was the only black woman in the professional section of the courtroom. There were other black women present, but they sat in the defendant's area, many looking worried as they waited for their cases to be called. At 11:30 a.m., a short recess was called. Sarah used this time to observe the other court officials. The clerk, a middle-aged woman with reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck, efficiently organized papers. The bailiff maintained order with a stern but fair demeanor. 2 police officers, including Officer Martinez who had given her the ticket, stood near the side door, occasionally whispering to each other. When court resumed, Sarah noticed Judge Patterson's demeanor had grown more impatient. He rushed through cases even faster than before, rarely letting defendants speak for more than a few seconds. Fines were handed out like candy at a parade, and most people simply accepted them with resigned sighs. Next case, Johnson versus City of Atlanta, the clerk finally called. Sarah stood smoothly, gathering her briefcase and tablet. As she walked toward the podium, she felt Officer Martinez's eyes following her. The click of her heels on the wooden floor echoed in the suddenly quiet courtroom. She placed her materials on the podium carefully, arranging them in the order she had practiced. Judge Patterson glanced up briefly, then back down at his papers. "Vehicle code violations," he muttered, already reaching for his gavel. "How do you plead?" Sarah stood straight, her voice clear and professional. "Not guilty, Your Honor. And I would like to present evidence regarding the technical specifications of my vehicle's modifications." The judge's head snapped up, surprise flickering across his face before settling back into his usual stern expression. He clearly hadn't expected such a confident response. Sarah could feel the energy in the courtroom shift as other defendants leaned forward in their seats, suddenly interested in what was about to unfold. Judge Patterson peered down at Sarah over his wire-rimmed glasses, his expression a mixture of annoyance and dismissal. The fluorescent lights of the courtroom cast harsh shadows across his face, making him appear even more intimidating. But Sarah remained steady, her posture perfect as she stood at the podium. "Ms. Johnson, The judge began, emphasizing the Ms. in a way that made it sound less like a title and more like an afterthought. Officer Martinez has documented clear violations of city codes regarding vehicle modifications. These are straightforward matters. Why are you wasting the court's time? Sarah opened her leather briefcase with calm deliberation. Your Honor, I believe there has been a misunderstanding regarding the technical specifications of my vehicle's modifications. If you'll allow me to present my evidence. Evidence? Judge Patterson interrupted, his voice carrying a hint of amusement that made several officers in the courtroom chuckle. Ms. Johnson, these are standard traffic violations. The officer's assessment is quite clear. Sarah noticed Officer Martinez standing straighter near the courtroom wall, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. The court clerk had even stopped shuffling papers to watch the exchange. The atmosphere in the room grew thicker with tension. Your Honor, Sarah continued, her voice steady despite the interruption, I have detailed documentation showing that all modifications to my vehicle are within legal limits. The window tinting is precisely at 70% transparency, 5% above the minimum requirement. The suspension system. Judge Patterson held up his hand, cutting her off mid-sentence. Ms. Johnson, are you suggesting that Officer Martinez, with his 15 years of experience, doesn't know how to measure window tinting? His tone dripped with condescension. The spectators in the courtroom shifted in their seats, some leaning forward with interest. Sarah could feel their eyes on her, but she remained focused on the judge. She had dealt with dismissive attitudes throughout her career, and this was no different. No, Your Honor, Sarah replied diplomatically. I'm stating that I have verifiable measurements and documentation that prove my compliance with city codes. She pulled out her first folder, labeled Window Tinting Specifications. The judge sighed heavily, making a show of checking his watch. Ms. Johnson, do you understand what these numbers mean? Did someone help you prepare these documents? A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Sarah felt her cheeks warm slightly at the obvious slight, but her voice remained professional. Yes, Your Honor, I understand these numbers perfectly. In fact, Look, Judge Patterson interrupted again, shuffling papers on his bench without looking at them. I have a full docket today. The fine is set at $750 for both violations. Pay the clerk on your way out. But Sarah stood her ground. Your Honor, I respectfully request the opportunity to present my complete defense. It's my right under state law, and I am prepared to demonstrate that these modifications are not only legal but exceed safety requirements. The judge's face reddened slightly. He clearly wasn't used to having his authority challenged, especially not by someone he had already dismissed in his mind. The courtroom fell silent, waiting to see how he would respond. Very well, he said through slightly clenched teeth. You have 5 minutes to present your case. But I warn you, Ms. Johnson, wasting this court's time will result in additional penalties. Sarah nodded respectfully and began organizing her documents on the podium. The sound of papers rustling seemed unusually loud in the silent courtroom. She could sense the judge's impatience growing with each passing second, but she wouldn't be rushed. Your Honor, she began, her voice clear and confident. I would like to start with Section 40 to 873.1 of the Georgia Code regarding window tint regulations. She pulled out a highlighted copy of the law, along with her certification documents. Judge Patterson leaned back in his chair, an expression of bored tolerance on his face. But Sarah noticed something else, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He had expected her to back down, to pay the fine, and leave like everyone else. Now he was faced with someone who not only knew her rights but was prepared to defend them with evidence. The next 5 minutes would either validate every assumption he had made about her or force him to confront his own prejudices. Sarah took a deep breath and prepared to present her case. Sarah started her presentation by placing a small device on the podium. It was a window tint meter, the same type used by law enforcement. The sight of the professional equipment caused Officer Martinez to shift uncomfortably against the courtroom wall. Your Honor, Sarah began, her voice steady and clear. This is a certified ATI tint meter, calibrated last month. She held up the calibration certificate, its official seal clearly visible. Would you like to examine it? Judge Patterson frowned, clearly caught off guard by the professional equipment. Ms. Johnson, where did you get that device? I purchased it from the same supplier that provides equipment to the Atlanta Police Department, Sarah replied calmly. As a professional engineer, I believe in using proper tools for accurate measurements. The word engineer caught the judge's attention, but he quickly masked his surprise with skepticism. And who helped you understand how to use this equipment? Sarah opened her second folder, pulling out her certification documents. I am fully trained in the use of all testing equipment related to my profession, Your Honor. But before we discuss my qualifications, I'd like to demonstrate the actual measurements of my vehicle's window tint. She played a video on her tablet, showing herself testing each window of her BMW the day after receiving the citation. The measurements clearly showed 70% light transmission, well within legal limits. As you can see, Your Honor, Sarah continued, her finger tracing the numbers on the readout. Each window exceeds the minimum requirement of 65% light transmission. I have notarized copies of these readings, along with timestamps and GPS coordinates. The judge leaned forward, his previous dismissive attitude giving way to reluctant interest. Some of the other defendants in the courtroom began whispering among themselves, impressed by Sarah's thorough preparation. Moving on to the suspension system, Sarah said, pulling out another set of documents. These are the original design specifications, approved by the Georgia Department of Transportation. She spread out detailed technical drawings on the podium. Ms. Johnson, Judge Patterson interrupted, his voice less harsh but still skeptical, who prepared these drawings for you? A small smile touched Sarah's lips. This was the opening she had been waiting for. I prepared them myself, Your Honor. These are my original calculations and designs, stamped with my professional engineer's seal. She held up the drawings, and the official PE stamp was clearly visible in the corner, along with her signature. The judge squinted at the documents, then back at Sarah, his previous assumptions visibly crumbling. The suspension modifications, Sarah continued, not waiting for another interruption, actually improved the vehicle's stability and safety. I've included stress test results and safety certification documents from an independent laboratory. She pulled out graphs and charts, each one meticulously labeled and color-coded. The technical data was overwhelming, but Sarah had prepared simple summaries for the court's benefit. Your Honor, if you'll look at Exhibit C, she said, pointing to a particularly detailed diagram, you'll see that the modified suspension system reduces stopping distance by 12% compared to the factory setup. This exceeds all state safety requirements by a significant margin. Judge Patterson picked up one of the documents, studying it with newfound attention. The courtroom remained silent, the usual shuffling and whispers replaced by intense focus on Sarah's presentation. Furthermore, Sarah added, pulling out her final piece of evidence, I have here the actual city codes regarding vehicle modifications. She handed a copy to the clerk, who passed it to the judge. You'll notice that Section 5, Paragraph 3 specifically allows for enhanced safety features that meet or exceed factory specifications. The judge flipped through the pages, his reading glasses now perched properly on his nose instead of being used to look down at her. The marked change in his demeanor was noticed by everyone in the courtroom. Sarah stood quietly, giving the judge time to review the documentation. She had presented her case precisely and professionally, backing every claim with solid evidence. The 5 minutes he had grudgingly given her were almost up, but she had made every second count. Officer Martinez had stopped smiling and was now studying his own copy of the vehicle codes with a furrowed brow. The other defendants in the courtroom watched with growing interest, many of them taking notes or photographing Sarah's displayed documents with their phones. The next few moments would determine whether facts and expertise could overcome prejudice and assumptions. Sarah remained standing tall, her case presented, ready for the judge's response. Judge Patterson removed his glasses slowly, cleaning them with a white handkerchief as he collected his thoughts. The courtroom remained silent, waiting for his response to Sarah's detailed presentation. When he finally spoke, his tone had changed noticeably. Ms. Johnson, he said, placing his glasses back on, you mentioned you're an engineer. Could you please state your full credentials for the record? Sarah straightened her blazer and spoke clearly into the microphone. Yes, Your Honor, I am Sarah Johnson, professional engineer, license number 34,800. 891, currently serving as lead structural engineer at Martinez and Associates engineering firm. I hold a master's degree in structural engineering from Georgia Tech. I'm currently overseeing the construction of the new Peachtree Tower downtown. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Several people recognized the name of the prestigious 40-story building project that had been making headlines. Officer Martinez's face showed surprise as he glanced down at his copy of the citation he had written. The Peachtree Tower? Judge Patterson repeated, his eyebrows rising. That's a $100 million project. Yes, Your Honor, Sarah replied calmly. In fact, I came directly from a site inspection the night Officer Martinez pulled me over. As the lead engineer, I'm responsible for ensuring all structural elements meet or exceed safety requirements, much like the modifications on my vehicle. She pulled out one more document from her briefcase. This is my current project authorization, showing my role as lead engineer. You'll notice it's signed by the City Planning Commission, as we work closely with them to ensure all building codes are met. The judge accepted the document, studying it carefully. His face showed a mix of emotions, surprise, embarrassment, and growing respect. The court clerk looked at Sarah with newfound admiration, while several of the waiting defendants whispered among themselves. Your Honor, Sarah continued, sensing the moment was right. My engineering background isn't just a job, it's how I approach every aspect of my life. When I modified my car, I applied the same principles of safety and precision that I use when designing a skyscraper. Every calculation was double-checked, every specification was researched, and every modification was tested. She gestured to her detailed documentation spread across the podium. These aren't just random numbers and diagrams. They represent hours of careful planning and professional expertise. When Officer Martinez suggested my modifications were illegal, I knew he was mistaken, not because I felt offended, but because I had the data to prove otherwise. Judge Patterson nodded slowly, a deep frown creasing his forehead. He shuffled through the papers again, this time paying careful attention to the technical details he had dismissed earlier. Ms. Johnson, he said finally, I must admit that your presentation is one of the most thorough I've seen in this courtroom. You've clearly approached this matter with professional diligence. Sarah remained composed, though inside she felt a wave of satisfaction. Thank you, Your Honor. I believe in being thorough, whether I'm designing a building or defending my rights. The judge turned to Officer Martinez. Officer, do you have any response to Ms. Johnson's evidence? Officer Martinez stepped forward, looking uncomfortable. Your Honor, while I stand by my initial assessment based on visual inspection, I have to acknowledge that Ms. Johnson's technical documentation appears to be correct. Our department's tint meters aren't calibrated as recently as hers. The atmosphere in the courtroom had transformed completely from an hour ago. The same people who had witnessed Judge Patterson's earlier dismissive attitude now watched him handling Sarah's documents with respect, carefully reviewing each page. Sarah noticed several young women of color in the audience taking pictures of her with their phones. One gave her a subtle thumbs up. She realized that this moment was becoming something larger than just her traffic citation. Furthermore, Your Honor, Sarah added, her voice steady and professional, I would be happy to provide the court with copies of all testing procedures and safety certifications. These documents might be helpful in future cases involving vehicle modifications, as they outline the proper methods for measuring and verifying compliance with city codes. The judge looked up at her, and for the first time that day, a slight smile crossed his face. The transformation was complete. Sarah was no longer just another defendant in his courtroom. She had proven herself a respected professional whose expertise could not be dismissed. Judge Patterson sat quietly for a moment, his hands folded on the bench in front of him. The usual stern lines of his face had softened, and he seemed to be wrestling with his thoughts. The courtroom remained silent, sensing that something important was about to happen. Ms. Johnson, he began, his voice carrying a new note of respect, would you mind walking me through these suspension calculations one more time? I admit I'm particularly interested in how you achieved that 12% improvement in stopping distance. Sarah nodded and pulled out her technical drawings again. This time, instead of being interrupted, she found herself engaged in a genuine discussion with the judge about engineering principles. She explained how the modified suspension system worked, using simple terms that everyone could understand. You see, Your Honor, It's like improving the shock absorbers in your desk chair, she explained, gesturing with her hands. Just as a good chair helps you stay balanced and comfortable, these modifications help the car stay more stable on the road. The judge leaned forward, genuinely interested. And these safety improvements, they're all documented and certified. Yes, Your Honor, Sarah replied, pulling out another document. Each modification was tested at the Atlanta Vehicle Safety Center. Here are the results, showing that my car actually performs better than factory standards in emergency situations. As she spoke, Sarah noticed a change in the judge's demeanor. The dismissive attitude from earlier had completely disappeared. Now he was treating her like a fellow professional, someone whose expertise he respected. Officer Martinez shifted uncomfortably near the wall. Other officers in the courtroom were whispering among themselves, reviewing their own understanding of vehicle codes. The court clerk had stopped pretending to do other work and was openly watching the exchange. Ms. Johnson, Judge Patterson said, removing his glasses, I must confess something. When you first started presenting your case, I made some assumptions that were clearly incorrect. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I presided over thousands of traffic cases, but I've rarely seen someone with your level of technical knowledge and preparation. Sarah maintained her professional composure, though her heart was racing. She could feel the weight of everyone's attention in the courtroom. The other defendants, who had been ready to pay their fines and leave, were now watching with renewed hope and interest. Your Honor, Sarah responded diplomatically, I appreciate your willingness to review the technical details of my case. As an engineer, I believe that data and evidence should speak for themselves, regardless of who presents them. The judge nodded slowly, a look of understanding crossing his face. He began gathering the documents spread across his bench, handling them with newfound respect. The technical drawings and certifications that he had initially dismissed were now being carefully organized. I have to ask, he said, looking up at Sarah, how many other drivers might have been cited incorrectly for similar modifications? Not everyone has your expertise to defend themselves. Sarah took a deep breath before answering. This was a chance to address a larger issue. That's a valid concern, Your Honor. In my professional opinion, there might be many cases where legally compliant modifications were misidentified as violations simply due to their appearance. The judge made some notes on his legal pad, his expression thoughtful. The scratching of his pen seemed loud in the quiet courtroom. Several people in the audience were nodding in agreement with Sarah's words. I'm also curious, Judge Patterson continued, about your work on the Peachtree Tower project. How does someone become a lead engineer on such a significant construction project? Sarah stood a bit straighter, proud of her achievements but remaining humble. It took years of hard work, Your Honor. I started as a junior engineer, worked my way up, and proved myself through dedication and attention to detail, the same attention to detail I applied to my vehicle modifications. The judge smiled slightly, appreciation showing in his eyes. The transformation was remarkable, from his initial dismissive attitude to this moment of genuine professional respect. Other court officials were watching the exchange with growing interest, perhaps seeing their own biases reflected in what had transpired. The morning's proceedings had become more than just a traffic court session. It had turned into a powerful lesson about assumptions, expertise, and the importance of looking beyond first impressions. Judge Patterson cleared his throat, the sound echoing through the now silent courtroom. He had spent the last few minutes reviewing all of Sarah's documentation one final time, though it was clear he had already made his decision. When he looked up, his face showed a mix of humility and determination. Before I make my ruling, he announced, his voice carrying clearly through the courtroom, I believe I owe Ms. Johnson an apology. He removed his glasses and placed them carefully on the bench, making direct eye contact with Sarah for the first time. Ms. Johnson, when you entered this courtroom today, I made immediate assumptions about you. I interrupted you multiple times, dismissed your evidence without proper consideration, and treated you with less respect than you deserved. He paused, letting his words sink in. This was unprofessional of me, and more importantly, it was wrong. Sarah stood steady at the podium, maintaining her dignified composure. The other defendants in the courtroom leaned forward, many recording this unusual moment on their phones. Officer Martinez stared at the floor, his face showing discomfort. Your presentation today, the judge continued, has done more than just prove your vehicle's compliance with city codes. It has forced me to confront my own biases, biases that have no place in this courtroom or in our justice system. He picked up one of Sarah's technical drawings, holding it up for the court to see. Ms. Johnson came prepared not just with claims, but with precise measurements, certified documentation, and professional expertise. She didn't just assert her rights, she proved them with facts and data that cannot be dismissed. The judge turned to Officer Martinez. Officer, I believe this case should prompt a review of how we handle vehicle modification citations. Perhaps we need better training and more precise measuring equipment to ensure we're not issuing incorrect citations. Officer Martinez nodded stiffly. Yes, Your Honor. I agree that our department could benefit from updated procedures. Judge Patterson then addressed the court clerk. Ms. Thompson, please make copies of Ms. Johnson's testing procedures and certification documents. I want them available as a reference for future cases involving vehicle modifications. The clerk nodded, already gathering the papers. Several other court officers were taking notes, recognizing that this case would set a new standard for handling similar situations. Ms. Johnson, the judge said, turning back to Sarah, your case is dismissed. All charges are dropped, and any fees you paid will be refunded. He paused, then added, but I'd like to go a step further. Sarah raised an eyebrow slightly, curious about what would come next. The judge picked up his pen and began writing in his legal pad. I'm entering a formal commendation into the court record, he explained as he wrote. Your presentation today wasn't just a defense of your case, it was a master class in professional preparation and technical expertise. Future defendants in this court will benefit from the standards you've helped establish. Sarah felt a wave of emotion, but kept her professional demeanor. Thank you, Your Honor. I appreciate your willingness to reconsider the evidence and your commitment to fairness. The judge nodded, then addressed the entire courtroom. Let this case serve as a reminder to all of us in the justice system. Our duty is to examine evidence fairly and without prejudice, regardless of who presents it. Today, Ms. Johnson has taught us a valuable lesson about the dangers of assumptions and the importance of expertise. Several people in the audience began to applaud, but the judge quickly raised his hand for silence. Ms. Johnson, before you leave, I have one more question. Would you be willing to conduct a training session for our traffic court officers about vehicle modifications and proper testing procedures? Sarah smiled genuinely for the first time that day. I would be honored, Your Honor. As an engineer, I believe in sharing knowledge that can help improve our systems. The judge's face showed relief and gratitude. Thank you. My office will contact you to arrange the details. He picked up his gavel, but before bringing it down, he added, This case has reminded us that justice works best when we put aside our preconceptions and listen to the evidence. Case dismissed. The sharp crack of the gavel echoed through the courtroom, marking the end of a case that had become much more than a simple traffic violation. It had become a moment of transformation, not just for Sarah, but for everyone who had witnessed it. As Sarah walked out of the courthouse into the bright afternoon sunlight, she was surprised to find a small crowd waiting for her. Several of the defendants from the courtroom had gathered outside, along with a few local news reporters who had heard about the unusual case through social media. Ms. Johnson called out a young woman, rushing forward with a notebook. I'm Lisa Chen from the Atlanta Daily News. Would you mind sharing your thoughts about what happened in there today? Sarah adjusted her briefcase strap, considering her response carefully. Today wasn't just about my case, she said thoughtfully. It was about the importance of being prepared and standing up for yourself when you know you're right. More people gathered around, many holding up their phones to record her words. A young black girl, maybe 12 years old, pushed through the crowd with her mother following close behind. Ms. Johnson, the girl said shyly, I want to be an engineer too. How did you learn all that stuff about cars and buildings? Sarah's face softened as she knelt down to the girl's level. What's your name? Jasmine, the girl replied. Well, Jasmine, it all starts with loving math and science, and never letting anyone tell you what you can't do. Sarah reached into her briefcase and pulled out one of her business cards. Have your mom email me, and I'll give you a tour of our engineering firm. Jasmine's eyes lit up as she carefully took the card. Other parents in the crowd started asking for cards too, especially those with daughters interested in STEM fields. A week later, Sarah's case had become a talking point in legal and engineering circles across Atlanta. The local bar association invited her to speak at their monthly meeting about bias in the courtroom. The engineering firm where she worked received numerous inquiries about their internship program, particularly from young women of color. True to his word, Judge Patterson had implemented changes in his courtroom. He required all officers to use properly calibrated testing equipment and document their measurements more thoroughly. The training session Sarah conducted for traffic court officers was so successful that other districts requested similar programs. One morning, as Sarah was reviewing blueprints in her office, her phone buzzed with a text message. It was a photo from Jasmine's mother, showing Jasmine proudly holding up her first-place ribbon from the school science fair. Her project, a study of vehicle safety modifications. Sarah smiled and pinned the photo to her office bulletin board, right next to her framed professional engineer license. As she turned back to her work, her office phone rang. "Ms. Johnson," her assistant's voice came through the speaker. "The City Planning Commission is on line 1. They want to discuss making you the head of their new Technical Advisory Committee for Vehicle Safety Standards." Before Sarah could respond, another call came in, and line 2 is from the Women in Engineering Association. They're asking if you'll be their keynote speaker at next month's conference. Sarah looked out her office window at the Peachtree Tower rising in the distance, its steel framework reaching toward the sky. What had started as a simple traffic stop had turned into something much bigger, a chance to open doors for others and change outdated systems. That evening, as Sarah drove home in her BMW, she passed the spot where Officer Martinez had pulled her over. The memory no longer brought frustration, only a sense of purpose. Her car's custom suspension hummed smoothly beneath her, a reminder that standing up for what's right, armed with knowledge and preparation, could create ripples of change far beyond one courtroom. At a red light, she noticed a police car pull up beside her. The officer inside gave her a respectful nod. Word had spread through the department about the engineer who knew her stuff. Sarah nodded back, appreciating how one moment of confronting bias had led to newfound respect and understanding. As she pulled into her driveway, Sarah's phone buzzed again. It was an email from a young woman who had been in the courtroom that day. "You inspired me to go back to school for engineering. Thank you for showing us that we deserve to be heard." Sarah sat in her car for a moment, reading the message again. Sometimes the biggest changes started with the smallest stands. One person refusing to back down, armed with knowledge, determination, and the courage to demand justice. Her traffic case had become more than just a legal victory. It had become a beacon of hope for others following in her path.